So the 2024-2025 budget is an interesting one in that it comes at a time when Kenya is still facing a lot of challenges from, of course, the conversation around public debt, but also the fact that the country has been facing very many challenges from the recent floods, issues to do with COVID-19. We are still facing the after effects. So it's really a balancing budget one in the sense of it has to take care of the fact that we have a big debt to repay, but at the same time we do have all these priorities that are coming up. So the main story of this budget lies in two places. The first one is that we have 1.8 trillion in debt that we have to pay in this particular year. So when you're thinking of a budget of just about 4 trillion, it means almost half of the budget will go just towards repaying debt. So we have to repay that debt because we borrowed at some point, it's falling due, so we need to repay that. But the second part of the story is the fact that for the first time, we are seeing the government actually reducing the size of the budget that goes to ministries and government departments, which is interesting because it's one thing that many Kenyans have been demanding. And so there are definitely significant cuts that have been made. But within that second story is where there's a bit of a dilemma for government, but also one area that citizens are definitely raising a lot of questions, which is, so where are we making the cuts? So if you look at the 2024-2025 budget, as a good portion of the cuts are actually being done in very basic services. Basic services like education, so there's a reduction in the budget for school feeding, there's a reduction in the budget for free primary education, there's a reduction in the budget quite heavily in the water sector, there's a reduction of the budget in some aspects of health, and the biggest one is actually a reduction in the budget for universities, and basically where we have tertiary education. So it's really a budget of two stories broadly. One which is debt repayment still remaining basically like the biggest ministry in government because that's where we are spending the biggest chunk of our money. But on the other side, we are seeing cuts in very significant social services, which many Kenyans, especially when you think about big parts of this country, the households are still very poor, right? If you look at the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, they say about 38% of Kenyans are poor. If we have a population of 51 million people, that means about 19 million people are poor. So when you cut resources to free primary education, what does it mean for that poor household? Somewhere in Turkana, somewhere in Mandera, somewhere in Nairobi, right? It means either they have to now start thinking of paying school fees because schools have to find a way to fund the institutions to keep running. And you can think of it across the tiers of education, right? So primary, secondary, and university. So if you have a household that has children in junior secondary, in secondary itself, in university, and there are all these cuts happening, then that's a big story for 2024-2025. What will be the implication at the household level? And that is a big concern for, I think, for many Kenyans. So when you look at the budget, it's one nice place to be able to see what the priorities are. I think any time as Kenyans we hear conversations about priorities for the country, you'll hear a lot of things that are said by government officials. But where really the rubber meets the road on what is a priority is the point where the government is putting its money. Now, when you look at our budget for 2024-2025, and in all fairness, it's been the same for the last couple of years. Biggest priority is debt repayment. And the basic reason for that is because when debt falls due, it has always to be the first thing that the government pays. And it's good for me to highlight here the fact that a big portion of that debt repayment is actually for domestic debt. So you can think of priority number one of the government as repaying debt to the domestic market, which basically is contributing to the economic growth, right? So when you hear banks make very nice profits, and everybody's wondering, where is this money that banks are making? It's because they are the biggest investors in government bonds and debt. So if government is paying its debt, banks are making their money and everyone investing in the domestic market. So that's the dilemma also. So of course for the current government, the bottom-up economic agenda is a central driving force of its prioritization, whether it's in the universal health coverage conversation, whether it has to do with building manufacturing aspects of food security. But as Kenyans, we need to think of this as not something that happens just periodically, within 1 year or 2 years. Because as a country, we do have a long-term plan on how we are supposed to develop, which is the Vision 2030. So when we're thinking about the priorities we see in a particular budget, we actually need to think of how well does it connect to the fact that we have this long-term plan, which is the Vision 2030, which then is broken down into smaller chunks of plans for every 5 years. And so if you look at the current 5-year plan that we have, which was launched a couple of months ago, you realize now the bottom-up economic agenda is in it. Right? So all this political prioritization language that we hear still has to find its way into how government planning works and how government budgeting works. So when you're evaluating then what the current year means on what the government is prioritizing, the executive still gets the largest share of the budget. As you know, when we budget now, because we have a slightly stronger separation of powers, there's also a separation of powers on how budgets are made. So the judiciary prepares its budget separately, the National Assembly, basically the whole of Parliament, because now we have 2 houses, also prepare their budget separately, and the executive, which is now where you have the president and all the ministries, also prepare their budgets separately. So the executive, of course, by the fact that it runs the civil service, has the biggest size of the budget. The judiciary and Parliament, form a smaller portion of it. Parliament's budget is just over 40 billion shillings. The judiciary just almost touching somewhere around 20 billion shillings. But the executive is 2-point-something trillion shillings, because that's where the ministries sit. So when we look at the executive side of the budget, which is probably the best tool that the government has to execute these plans that we are talking about, including accommodating, the different manifestos and agendas of the government of the day, is we see some interesting interplays in the 2024-2025 budget. So for example, the bottom-up economic agenda is big on food security. But when you look at the agriculture budget, it's one that is getting quite a significant cut in 2024-2025. And so that kind of speaks to a policy agenda that seems to be going in the opposite direction when it comes to the allocation of the resources. And you can think of it the same way when it comes to aspects of the universal health coverage. A big agenda for the government, but then when you go to the budget, there is of course an element of is it getting the fair share of resources that it requires, because this is getting a bit of a cut as well. But there's a bigger discussion even within the universal health coverage, which is again a prioritization conversation on how much of that money should be sitting at the national government and how much of that money should be sitting with the counties, because it's counties that are going really to be the big drivers of universal health coverage by the fact that they run literally all of the health facilities that are public, with the exception of only 6 that are run by the national government. When we are looking at budgets, there are a couple of things we need to do so that we make sure we get the full picture. Number one, never look at the budget just for 1 year on its own. Always look at it with past budgets as well, because it gives you context on where we are coming from and how things are changing over time. But number two, also look at it against the policies that are in place, because that gives you a picture on what is it that we plan to invest in as a country. That's where the policy sits. But also what is it that we're actually putting money into, because that tells you whether we are really working to actualize those priorities. So the 2024-2025 budget is a mix of very many things, from the challenges of dealing with our debt to the challenges of how do we make sure we are still able to take care of society at a point when the country is facing very many challenges that are making it very difficult for people to be able to access services. And this budget seems to be facing challenges of we don't have enough money. So once we pay debt, then we have to make cuts, which is what the government seems to have done. But there's still the question of, are those the right areas to cut? because in the same budget on the executive side, we do see increases in certain areas where there are questions, right? So when the resources for the State Department for Devolution and Planning are going up, we know the biggest driver of that department is actually CDF. So is CDF a priority? It's for public discussion. Between CDF and free primary education, what should be getting a cut and an increase? Right? So that's a fair discussion to have as well. There are also allocations, across different areas that, people might argue whether they are priorities or not. Allocation for tree planting. Again, between school feeding program and tree planting, what is it that the government should be investing in? So it's really a budget of many contradictions, but also a budget that seems to align with a certain strong need for the government to cut spending, but also make sure they are making an effort to increase where the resources are coming from. So there are a couple of significant differences. So the first difference is the fact that the 2023-2024 budget operated for quite some period when the Kenyan shilling was very weak. So our debt repayment shot up by a lot. It went up by nearly 200 billion shillings, simply because for all the external debt that we owe is in foreign currency. So when the shilling lost value, literally the government had to come in and do a supplementary budget, basically revise the budget, so that they could incorporate the fact that any external debt we have to pay, now the value had gone up. So that was quite a significant dilemma for the government, and one thing they had to accommodate within 2023-2024. So in 2024-2025, we are kind of formulating and approving the budget at a time when the shilling has become a bit more stable. So while yes, debt repayment remains a big issue, the uncertainty on it is not as high as it was in 2023-2024. So one big difference was just the impact of the depreciation of the Kenyan shilling and the kind of the knock effect it had on the budget. So that was one big challenge. The second one is that in the 2023-2024 budget, the government was still expanding its spending, especially at the ministerial level. 2024-2025, we are seeing the government actually contracting the budget, which is a very rare thing because the Kenyan government for the longest time, I can go back 10 years, has always had a budget that expanded every year. Regardless of whether we had money or not, there was always an effort to increase spending. So this has been one of the first times we are seeing, actually between these 2 years, where there is a contraction, so basically reducing the size of what the government thinks it should spend. But to be clear, the total budget size is still going up because the debt repayment is still growing by more than 10%. So debt repayment remains a big issue. It is at the point of service delivery where the government is actually reducing the size of the budget. But the overall budget, when you take the budget that goes to our ministries and then you take public debt, when you combine them, that is still going up between the 2 years. But it's a good point to highlight the fact that the ministerial one is actually going down, something that Kenyans have really been pushing for. And as I said, are those the right places to make cuts? So that's also something that is important. The third thing, which I think is something that that is also unique to 2024-2025, is the fact that, in the 2023-2024, the government created quite a number of additional, what they call state departments. They're like mini ministries. Let me give an example. If you think of the Ministry of Health, previously it used to just be Ministry of Health. At some point, it was broken into two, right? So you have the State Department for Medical Services, and you have the State Department for Professional Standards and something. Now, what that means is that when you're creating more state departments, it means you're increasing the administrative costs of running government, right? So as the government has continued to kind of break up ministries and create these state departments, I think we might remember in 2023 there was an executive order number 1, right, which created these state departments. So those state departments now are full mainstream. This is the first year where they are fully in the budget. And so it will be interesting, again, to look at them from the perspective of, are those increasing the cost of government? Because they have certain structures that they have to run with. The other one which I spoke to a bit is 2024-2025 compared to 2023-2024 is we are seeing a significant adjustment in social protection programs. And here I'm speaking on it just from an equity perspective. Social protection is about the poor. Social protection is about poor households. So across board, in the 2024-2025 budget, you are seeing cuts across social protection programs, whether it's resources that go to social protection for the elderly, whether it's resources that go to special education institutions, whether it's resources that go to social protection for orphans and vulnerable children, so resources that go to, as I was saying, the school feeding program. All those are getting cuts. So they seem to be a very heavy adjustment of social protection programs compared to 2023-2024. Now, government priorities are informed in different layers, but it's important for me to highlight that regardless of where the priorities come from, they all have to find their space within Kenya's public finance arrangement, or basically the way the government plans, the way the government allocates resources, and the way the government spends those resources. But they come from a couple of key areas. Number one, Vision 2030, blueprint is the Bible of what the priorities for the country should be. So that's the first place. And every policy, every plan that comes from Vision 2030 then becomes a significant part of what informs, especially the key areas of government priorities. So there's that one part. The second one, the government of the day. So they promise people things, they have to try and deliver those things. Regardless of how ridiculous they might have been at the point of promising, at the point of delivery, they have to find their space within that, budgeting framework. So every time, there are new governments that come in, and I don't want us here to think just of government from the perspective of the president. Think of the president, think of the ministers, think of members of parliament, think of members of county assemblies, think of governors. All those fellows promised certain things when they were campaigning. So the political class is a big driver also of where the priorities do come from. Number three, Kenya is a lower middle income country. So we're supposed to look a bit more rich. But we're still dependent heavily on donor funding. So donors also are a big driver of some of the priorities that we see in our budgets and in our country and in the trajectory our development takes. So if there's a donor X who is putting in money for immunization, you can be sure that then they have a say on what the priorities should be. If there is a donor X putting in money for agriculture and food security, then they have a say in terms of what the priorities should be. So I think donors, or what we popularly in Kenya call development partners, definitely do contribute a lot to what the priorities we are pursuing as a country, which I think is also something important to highlight. But also we have citizens, and this comes in different forms, right? So of course, whenever all these processes are happening, there are elements of public participation, and that is supposed to also be the place where citizens are able to say what they like, what they don't like, what they need changed, or what they think is important to be included. And there's a whole discussion out there on how effective public participation is. But the work that we do at IBP has shown us over time, especially at the county level, that public participation definitely has some effect. It might not be at the point that citizens want, but we do see adjustments that are made in budgets that are related to input that came from the public. And we're even now seeing more reports that come from county governments and the national government, where they're able to highlight this is what citizens said, and this is what we've taken up, and explanations for where sometimes they don't take it up. It's not as widespread, but we do see those priorities getting into the budget progressively, and we hope that keeps improving. So that's another place where priorities come from. Big question: how much do all these priority lines kind of align with each other? That's where the challenge is, right? So sometimes what Vision 2030 says versus what the politicians want to do, versus what the donors are thinking, versus what citizens woke up and feel this is the priority. Sometimes they don't all come together. But that is supposed to be the place where the budget brings everything together. So when we are thinking about how the process of budget works, one of the things we have to pay attention to is how are all these priorities being debated, what trade-offs we are making between the different priorities, because somebody says we need to introduce a tax on motor vehicles, and somebody else who is a citizen says, no, I don't need to pay that. Then another institution that has given us a loan says you actually need to do that because you need to collect more money. What is the level of debate on what the trade-off is being made, what the impact is going to be? So one of the areas where we've had challenges as a country is actually bringing all these priorities together in a way that cohesively somebody is able to see, oh, this is how everything came together, this is the discussion that happened, and this is how we arrived at the final decisions that informed the budget.